Debunking. Such a common term. It's a fairly new thing, but where did it all start? What is the history of debunking and how did we get to where we are now? Welcome to the channel, or welcome back to the channel. My name is Florio, and this week we're going to discuss debunking. Now, this actually got a little out of hand in my research, and this is probably going to be a pretty long video. We're going to go through a lot of ancient civilization stuff, and then into the Victorian spiritualist era, and then back into modern day again. So bear with me. If you enjoy long videos, then this is the video for you, and if not, you can always pause it and come back to it later. So, debunking. How did it all start? Well, it kind of began with free thinking, critical thought, and skepticism. This radical way of questioning things is all part of debunking and what has created debunking. For the history of free thinking, we have to head way back to when humans were first trying to make sense of the world. Before science and skepticism were formal tools that we all used, people actually leaned very heavily on myths and legends to explain the unexplainable. But as human civilization evolved and settled into cities, some began asking, does this really make sense anymore? From these early questioners to the skeptics who challenged tradition, they laid the groundwork for reason. And this is what we'll be covering today. I will walk you through some of the key figures and moments in history that played a role in the rise of critical thinking and skepticism. From philosophical musings of ancient civilizations to the debunking era during the Victorian spiritualist movement, let's journey together through different eras and eons to trace the origins of debunking. Ancient debunking. In many ancient societies, questioning traditional beliefs was not necessarily framed as debunking, but rather it was a quest for truth and a better understanding of our natural world. These critical thinkers often worked on the philosophical and religious debates of their time, challenging accepted views and advocating for explanations based on observation and reason. Our modern act of questioning things, being skeptical, and developing critical thinking skills most strongly derive from these thinkers and philosophers of the ancient world. Now, of course, law of averages would tell us that there were critical thinkers and philosophers in even the Aboriginal peoples of each country, like going back to when we all lived in caves or when we were living in migratory tribes. But it's very difficult to dig up stories about these type of people, as a lot of stories back then were passed down verbally, and we weren't really at the point where we were recording things and making copies of recordings to keep in libraries. So I'm going to mainly discuss the ancient civilizations that have surviving records that we can actually look at. Now, I was attempting to do this in chronological order, but I will admit the timelines are kind of all over the place. So I'm going to go in order of ancient civilization regions and then work our way east and then back around again for the Victorian era. Specifically, starting with civilizations that began to settle in full cities. They had agriculture, commerce, religion, and so forth. As these settled civilizations have records that still survive today that we can look at. So we're going to start with ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt, a superpower. A bit of a heads up here. I'm going to go on a little bit of a side tangent at first, but I think it's a good one, so just bear with me on this as I talk about a few things that have been kind of driving me crazy lately. Yes, it's actually related back into ancient Egypt, ironically. Okay, so some people may argue that the history of philosophy started in ancient Greece. However, Egypt was much older and more influential than people realize or choose to remember. Greece philosophers and thinkers started to take off after their Dark Ages, so it was around 600 or 700 BCE. Ancient Egypt began their golden society in 3100 BCE. Many people forget how long ancient Egypt stood as a superpower. Lasting thousands of years, it stood strong as a very advanced civilization. We tend to not realize how far we fell from that time. Humankind spent a long time in a sort of dark ages of knowledge. And it's only been a short time that we started making new strides in the sciences and discovery. Often people don't appreciate just how young our technology-driven civilization actually is. So with ancient Egypt lasting over 3,000 years, it would only make sense that there were thinkers and philosophers well before the philosophy trend that started in ancient Greece. And that really was the case. It was just ancient Egypt was more secretive and ancient Greece was more open. Egypt had very advanced technical knowledge in the sciences. It is quite interesting. Looking back, they were very devout, a civilization who lived by their deities and for their deities, yet they made huge strides in the sciences. When science usually dictates skepticism and critical thinking, ancient Egyptians found a way to balance this with devout worship of deities that they really had no proof existed. They in fact had such advanced knowledge that the Greek scholars came to Egypt to learn their secrets. For example, Pythagoras came to Egypt to learn advanced mathematics of the priesthood. Priesthood had knowledge of, how to build other grand structures. Amongst other things, they had a lot of mathematical knowledge. But we'll go back to Pythagoras a bit later here. The main issue looking back at ancient Egypt is we still don't fully know all of their language. We actually only know parts of it thanks to the Rosetta Stone, and these parts have helped us translate ancient texts. However, many people don't realize that we're actually making guesses on a lot of the words and letters, as we had to make assumptions because a chunk of the Rosetta Stone is missing. And the hieroglyphics are so unique that we kind of have to make guesses on some of it. So why does this matter? Well, it means that we don't have a full picture of everything that actually happened during their thousands of years of their reign. Ancient Egypt unified itself as a singular power in 3100 BCE, and it lasted until its conquest by Rome, who took control in 30 BCE. Even before its unification, it actually existed as Upper and Lower Egypt, which they had religions and philosophies and sciences and so forth. They were still very advanced civilizations compared to the surrounding countries. They were just two different regions, two different countries, and they decided to join together. To be so advanced, to build, invent, and take care of so many settled people, that requires free thinkers. The sharing of ideas, the discussing and analyzing of thoughts, plans, beliefs, etc. So even though ancient civilizations were more heavily influenced by religion, they still had some of the greatest minds of their time, which gave us the knowledge to further invent and create. And things that we do daily are still affected by the knowledge that they found out those thousands of years ago. Now, full disclosure as well, I love ancient Egypt and I've studied it immensely since I was like 5 years old. So I know a lot about it. And yes, I'm giving them a much longer intro, but I just wanted to do this bit of a side tangent because I feel like I've been seeing so much misunderstanding or ignorance of how advanced humankind actually was back then. People forget, like, the Dark Ages literally put us back into pretty much caveman brains. We had to start back over. We weren't allowed to read. We weren't allowed to write because of the church. We had to start over again. We lost so much advancement right after that time. So many people treat ancient civilizations as if they were somehow beneath us, as if they were stupid people just because it was thousands of years ago. People, they actually believe aliens had to be the ones to invent and build everything because humankind was too dumb. And that just doesn't make any sense. They weren't too dumb. It's just we experienced 600 years of oppression that brought us back down to basic intellect, and we've been building up since then. Who are the real dummies here? People who think that ancient Egyptians were dumb and could only get help by aliens, or, people don't realize what happened in human history. But anyway, yes, I wanted to get this stuff off my chest so y'all get to listen to another one of my rants. I've just been seeing so much with that it's not even new, that stupid what's underneath the pyramids crap, and all the conspiracy theories are coming out. That was discovered, I think it was 2021 or something. It's been a couple of years that was out, and for some reason now, the last couple of weeks, it's been conspiracy theories everywhere about the pyramids. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's dive into the preservation of knowledge in ancient Egypt. How ancient Egypt preserved their knowledge. So how did ancient Egyptians pass down their knowledge? Not just religious dogma, but real working knowledge. And they did this across centuries. Well, enter the scribes. Outside of the elite priest college of knowledge, Egypt had a full-blown scribal education system. Think of it as like an ancient vocational school, but with a sacred twist to it. Young scribes were trained for years in these schools, which were usually attached to royal palaces or temples. They learned how to write, do practical math, keep records, and calculate the stars. A lot of the training was all about memorization and copying. Copying texts and knowledge was a sacred act. It kept essential texts alive, word for word, generation after generation. Scribes were the guardians of cultural memory. I think that practice is passed down in Judaism as well, the copying of text too, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, just off the top of my head. So they actually called these schools and centers the Per-Ankh, which meant House of Life. The Per-Ankh was found inside all the major temples. These were the schools, the libraries, they were the research institutions. Scribes worked here to duplicate the text on medicine, astronomy, spells, rituals, and so much more. For example, there's a scroll called the Ebers Papyrus, and it's a 110-page medical scroll. It's believed to have come from the house, or one of the houses of life, and it wasn't a one-off. There's other copies of the same text that pop up hundreds of years apart. The scribe system was responsible for keeping knowledge like this in circulation. And we'll get to this in a bit, but there was a hidden knowledge and discussion of ideas. It was locked behind closed doors for priests only. So there was secret knowledge that they protected, but then there was the public knowledge, and that's what the scribes would work on during their training. This whole action of sharing knowledge and copying texts, like I said, it was considered a sacred act to honor the gods. So the more public texts that the scribes were working on, they were available to the public. They allowed lay professionals and foreign visitors to come in and look at the text, the ones at least that the scribes were working on. There was like more sacred secret texts that the higher up priests had access to. There were even royal libraries like Ramses II, House of Books. He had a library actually in his palace. Scribes didn't just copy the past, they carried it forward. Their legacy wasn't carved in stone, but inked into papyrus. But let's circle back to the priesthood and the knowledge that they did gatekeep. Egyptian priesthood, gatekeepers of knowledge and order. In ancient Egypt, if you wanted to find the smartest people in the room, you looked to the priests. They weren't just religious figures, they were astronomers, doctors, scientists, archivists, and administrators. Temples weren't just for prayer, they were Egypt's intellectual infrastructure. Each major temple complex acted like a research institution. Inside the House of Life, the temples were the House of Life, that we discussed earlier, scribes weren't the only ones copying the texts. Since copying text was a sacred duty, priests also did this daily as well. But priests were responsible for preserving sacred texts and knowledge, like secret ones. And there were different ranks of priests. And as you worked up the ranks, it opened them up to more knowledge and specialization, as well as more freedom to discuss ideas. Because the discussion of said knowledge and disseminating it and like bending it, that was only allowed for certain levels of priests. Low-ranking priests were responsible for refining the calendar, maintaining medical treatment records, and ensuring protection of moral teachings through proverbs and wisdom literature. High-ranking priests were among the most educated people in Egypt. They studied hieroglyphics, advancements in healing, the star cycles, technology, math, and so forth. And there were specialized roles as well within these ranks. Lector priests handled scriptures. Hour priests tracked the heavens or the skies. Ka priests ran the funerary rituals. And Sunu priests, they functioned as temple doctors. Like I said, priests, they work on astronomy, medicine, math, agriculture, ethics. They worked on the parts of the knowledge that was gatekept behind these higher level priesthoods. They also were allowed some freedom of thought, like I was telling you. Priests were the closest thing to freethinkers in ancient Egypt society. Most offices, though, within the priesthood, they were hereditarily passed down, and temple education started very young. The young scribes' work was focused on perfecting, not innovating. But temples controlled vast resources and wielded great political power. During some periods, the high priests of Amun of these temples were more powerful than the pharaohs themselves. They were running regions, collecting taxes, and even forming dynasties. The priests didn't just preserve knowledge, they controlled it. Parts of the Parank were restricted. The priesthood decided what was sacred and what was safe, and what was meant for public and what was meant for private eyes only. And within the walls, they actually would work on disseminating stuff and discussing ideas. But there were strict rules around it. Intellectual freedom wasn't the goal, continuity was. While this seems really restrictive, it really wasn't for their culture. Ancient Egyptian culture was very orderly. There was still critical thinking that existed within their philosophies, and I'll get more into that when we discuss a key goddess, Maat. But this whole system, it just worked for them. Egypt's priests managed to pass down centuries of medical, astronomical, philosophical writings with astonishing loyalty. They didn't invent critical thinking as a rebellion, but they did practice it as a refinement, observing, recording, teaching, not to challenge the gods, but to serve them more precisely. And that was their goal when they did actually do some critical thinking and working through stuff and discussing ideas. It was about making sure that the knowledge that they had was precise and correct in the gods' eyes. As well, just a side note, there weren't many female priestesses. The only ones were usually working as doctors, or there were priestesses who managed the worship of the goddess Hathor as well. And there was a special priestess though, and we'll get to her a little bit later. Egypt's quiet skeptics. So, like I said, ancient Egypt wasn't known for its radical freethinkers. The priesthood was a guarded tradition, and surprisingly, public dissent was very rare. Their civilization existed in a very controlled conservative world, and yet there only seems to be minimal pushback by the people. But that doesn't mean that there weren't any free thinkers out there. There were some that popped up from time to time. And of course, we don't know the totality of all Egyptian history, but we can see other voices shine through their literature. Some of these pieces have been found inside tombs and on walls, and I'll just go through a quick list of some of them. There is one called the Harper's Songs. This is found in tombs. These pieces sometimes question the afterlife itself. One version suggests no one really knows what happens after death and urges people to enjoy life now, which was a bold move in Egyptian culture that was totally based around funerary rites and life after death. The dispute between a man and his Ba shows a man debating his soul, wrestling with despair and questioning whether piety even pays off. It's a rare philosophical glimpse of a personal doubt. The next one is the tale of eloquent peasant. It's a social critique wrapped in a story. A poor man denounces a corrupt official and demands justice. This piece was used to train scribes, and this shows that the Egyptians valued the idea of justice even if reality fell short. The next piece is called The Admonitions of Epicure. This is a poetic lament for a broken world. Famine, reverse class order, and chaos. Whether political or symbolic, it's a text deeply unsettled by change. And then there's an actual pharaoh in around 1350 BCE who ditched the old gods in favor of a one-god monotheistic religion. He rewrote religion with his great hymn, and we're going to talk more about this pharaoh. His name is Akhenaten. Akhenaten, the pharaoh who dared to disrupt. Now, here's where things get a little bit spicy in ancient Egyptian history. Around 1353 BCE, Pharaoh Akhenaten launched one of the boldest religious reforms in ancient history. He didn't just introduce a new god who was called Aten, a sun god. He tried to actually erase the old ones entirely. He ended up shutting down temples and moved the capital city to a brand new one called Amarna. And he declared that Aten was the only true god. He didn't do this because of spiritual beliefs. Well, I mean, he may have believed in this one god, but really he was scared of the power of the priests and of the power that they held over the people. Officials to the pharaoh actually held dual titles. titles. For example, a chief steward of the king might also be a high priest of such and such a deity. These officials managed both royal and divine estates. As well, all these priests with their temples were exempt from the majority of taxes, and they had their own treasuries that they didn't have to declare or account for, which caused occasional tension between the crown when resources were scarce. Yet pharaohs also depended on the priests for governing the people, keeping them happy. The temples acted as local administrative centers for grain storage, food control, law, courts, etc. It's kind of like the pharaoh was kind of like the president who you never get to actually meet, whereas like the temples were like your local mayoral office, right? Where you actually get to talk to someone face to face. There's also another interesting thing. The one most powerful role a priestess could hold is God's wife of Amun. The highest ranking priestess of Amun would take on this role, and at a certain point in history, she actually began to wield more power than the pharaoh himself. So essentially, this priestess held the most power in all of Egypt. This political clout of the priesthood as a class is exactly why pharaohs at times appointed loyalists to the high priest positions to keep temples in check, kind of making sure their men are in the temples. These issues are what started Akhenaten to vocally express concern for the ever-growing power the priests held, and he enacted his plan. It was a full-blown political move aimed at breaking the power of the priesthood. It is said that Akhenaten wasn't a very smart pharaoh compared to others, and this is why his reform plan failed. Maybe no one told him about appointing loyalists, or maybe he just didn't have the charisma needed to finesse the structure of working with the temples, but he really did see what was going on, and it did become a problem eventually with Egypt too. So what he warned of did come to fruition. And there are texts that say that he wasn't a very smart man, but that could have also been an insult to him after he died, because sometimes that happens. They write horrible things about someone after they're dead, and it's not really what happened while they were alive, so we don't know. Either way, this attempt at monotheism was very radical for Egypt, a land steeped in tradition and ritual. Akhenaten's vision restructured art, language, and society around a singular divine force, one that didn't require intermediaries like priests. While some see him as a visionary, others view him as a tyrant or a fanatic. This is why what we hear about in history with him, what they wrote about him, you gotta take with a grain of salt. But what is clear is that he forced a nation to rethink everything, from how gods were worshipped to how power was distributed. That alone makes him one of the most revolutionary figures in Egypt's long history. Now, they placated him while he was alive. Immediately after his death, the old gods returned, the new capital was abandoned, and the priesthood regained its influence very quickly. All of his reforms were swiftly undone, but his story did live on through the ages, so he had some impact, whether it was good or bad. Okay, so besides this pharaoh, Egypt did have two influential philosophers that I want to discuss. But to understand the first one, I need to give you a little bit of a rundown of an Egyptian goddess. One might even label her the goddess of critical thinking. Mahat, goddess of truth, balance, and rational order. Mahat was a central concept in ancient Egyptian religion, representing the cosmic order that Egyptians believed was essential for a harmonious universe. Mahat was considered the daughter of the sun god Ra and the wife of Thoth, the god of wisdom. Mahat was more than a goddess, though. She represented truth, balance, justice, and the natural order. She was the embodiment of what Egyptians strived to uphold in their daily lives. The rulers of ancient Egypt were seen as the earthly representatives of the gods and responsible for upholding order and justice. So the role of representing and paying service to Mahat was the duty of the ruler. In Egyptian society, she was everywhere. Kings ruled through Mahat. Judges swore oaths to uphold Mahat. And thinkers like Ptahhotep and others saw her as the grounding force of wisdom itself. She represented rationality and structure, a cosmic principle that emphasized harmony between thought, action and the world. She wasn't about blind faith. She was about integrity, accountability, and understanding. She's often depicted with an ostrich feather on her head, and in some depictions, she would also be displayed having wings on her back, which symbolize protection and guidance. Egyptians believed that after they died, their heart would be weighed against Mahat's feather. It was a metaphor for how you lived. Were your actions light with honesty or heavy with deceit? This wasn't just religion, it was a moral philosophy that the Egyptians lived their daily life by. For scholars and scribes, Mahat gave a framework for reason. She was the lens through which they interpreted law, medicine, astronomy, and ethics. You could almost say that she made rational thought a sacred act. She influenced how ancient Egyptian thinkers questioned the world, not to rebel, but to better align with the universal truth. That influence can't be overstated. In a way, Mahat was Egypt's version of logic and ethics rolled into a single divine concept. And this is what our first ancient Egyptian philosopher built upon. Ptahhotep, Ethical Roots of Reason. Ptahhotep was a vizier around 2400 BCE. He was one of Egypt's earliest and most influential thinkers. His Maxims of Ptahhotep isn't just a collection of advice, it's one of the oldest known texts of applied philosophy. He emphasized self-restraint, humility, careful speech, and justice, not as commandments, but as ideals for living a balanced, thoughtful life. Ptahhotep spoke to both personal behavior and civic responsibility. He encouraged listeners to think before they speak, listen to others even when they disagree, and choose wisdom over pride. His tone wasn't authoritarian, it was reflective, almost like a mentor passing down experience rather than law. What's most striking is how much of his teaching centers around listening, learning, and weighing your options. That's critical thinking in action, not blind obedience, but considered judgment. Ptahhotep wasn't preaching in a vacuum. His ethics were rooted in the philosophical foundations of Mahat, and this is why she plays such a pivotal role in critical thinking in ancient Egypt. I do find it fascinating. Ancient Egyptians kind of remind me a bit of the Vulcans in Star Trek. They were very, very orderly society, very conservative, but they had minimal dissenters. Like, people were, for the most part, happy with how things were, and the society carried on for so long. So I do find it very fascinating. All right, now let's take a look at a second prominent ancient Egyptian philosopher. Irshesh, the scribe who spoke his mind. Now, we're going to bounce ahead 1,000 years later into the New Kingdom, about 1200 BCE. This is where we meet Irshesh, a scribe who stands out not just for what he wrote, but how he wrote it. He had a text that he wrote called The Satire of the Trades. It was technically a school exercise when he was a scribe, but it reads like a bit of a sassy TED Talk. In it, Irshesh goes job by job, talks about farmers, soldiers, potters, fishermen, and he pretty much tears them all apart. He calls out all the pain, the exhaustion, the dirt, and the misery that each one of these jobs has. Then he pivots and basically says, be a scribe, we think, we write, we don't get filthy. On the surface, it actually seems comical because it's such over-exaggeration for writing at that time. But there's some depth here. Irshesh isn't just glorifying scribes. He's showing the growing awareness of intellectual labor as a force in society. He knows that scribes shape ideas, record law, and preserve memory. And through humor, he's making a case for the value of thought over toil. There's also a critical edge to it. By poking fun at other professions, Irshesh shines a light on class labor and the structure of Egyptian society. He's playing within the system, but also nudging at the edges. And for a student exercise, him being only a scribe at the time, that was a pretty bold move that he did. What Irshesh shows us is that scribes were also observers. They were commenters, and in moments like this, even sometimes jokers, having a little bit of satire and fun. His voice was sharp, witty, and self-aware, and it gives us a glimpse of how some Egyptians used intellect not just to serve power, but also to reflect on it. Also, I just kind of touched the surface of this stuff because it's important, again, I'll remind you, ancient Egypt lasted over 3,000 years, even longer if you want to include the period as Lower and Upper Egypt. So there's going to be periods of change throughout the generations. Egypt's change just happened to be slower and more minimal per century because the people weren't as unhappy as other civilizations. Like that's what kind of seems to cause a lot of change. They were a strong society, their army was strong, they had money, the people were happy, so change moved slowly. So anyway, I didn't talk about ancient Egypt first just because it's older than ancient Greece, but because ancient Egypt directly influenced a lot of Greek philosophers, free thinkers, and scientists. So let me explain more about this. Egypt to Greece, the philosophical connection. Before we fully step into ancient Greece, we need to talk about this connection that's often overlooked. How much Greek philosophy was influenced by Egypt. Just a brief note while I'm editing. It was late when I recorded this, and for some reason, I didn't say Pythagoras' name correctly. I kept saying it wrong through this whole thing. So I'm going to correct it where I can, do an overlay on it. Sometimes I speak a little too fast and I can't catch it. For centuries, Egypt was seen as a land of deep wisdom. Greek thinkers like Thales, Pythagoras, and Plato reportedly traveled there to study with the priests and temple scholars. They weren't just tourists, they were actually students. The Greeks admired Egypt's sense of cosmic order, especially the concept of Mahat, which shaped ideas about natural law, ethics, and reason. Pythagoras picked up more than just math here, too. His belief in the spiritual power of numbers, it echoed the Egyptian cosmology. He was also the only foreigner to be accepted into the Egyptian priesthood. Pythagoras, who gave us the Pythagorean theorem, came to Egypt to actually learn their advanced mathematics. People really like to say that, like I said again, that aliens built the pyramids, when in reality, Egypt just held those mathematical secrets within the priesthood. They didn't let those secrets out so easily. And that's why we can't find records of it all over the place. Now, some additional philosophers that went to Egypt as well. Plato, in some of his texts, refers to Egyptian priests as keepers of ancient knowledge. Even the Socratic ethics, humility, self-examination, and dialogue, they find early roots in Egyptian wisdom texts like those of Ptahhotep. So no, Greek philosophy didn't emerge in a vacuum. It actually picked up a thread that ran straight from the Nile into the Aegean. Ancient Greece, the rise of reason and skeptical thought. Before we dig deeper into Greek philosophers, just a little reminder, philosophers, what they are nowadays, are more liberal arts. But back then, philosophers were scientists. Like, they were anyone who was thinking about ideas and having critical thought. So just keep that in mind, that a lot of these philosophers of the Greek time and Roman time and ancient Egypt philosophers, like the majority of them were actually scientists and they were actually having scientific breakthroughs. So just remember that when we talk about their knowledge and their critical thinking. So like I said, when we hit ancient Greece, we're not starting from scratch. We're picking up from Egypt. But this time, critical thought isn't being done in a vacuum like it is in Egypt. Ancient Greece was free thinking. They were all about new ideas, experimenting in different ways. Greek culture was abundant in fostering people's mind and body, evolving their psyche, spirit, and more. So now imagine all the secrets that the Egyptian priests held now being available to everyone who's allowed to challenge the norm, talk openly about them, and exchange ideas. Of course, philosophy exploded at this point. Scientific discoveries thrived, and ancient Greece laid the framework for everything that was to come. Starting in the 6th century BCE, Greek thinkers began turning away from myth and towards reason. They weren't just telling stories anymore. They were asking, what's actually going on here? Philosopher Thales asked what the world was made of, and he landed on water. Not because it was correct, but because he was looking for a natural explanation. His successors, Anaximander and Anaximenes, followed up with their own theories, the boundless, air, and more. It was less about the answers and more about changing the question. Then came the atomists, Leucippus and Democritus, in the 5th century BCE. They proposed that everything is made of tiny invisible atoms moving through a void. No gods were needed, just matter and motion. Yes, there was talks of atoms and physics and sort of the micro world before they could even see it or prove that it existed. Democritus, often called the laughing philosopher, argued that knowledge comes through the senses and reason. This was a serious pivot towards a scientific worldview. Even Aristotle, who disagreed with him, respected his logic. There were skeptics too, like Xenophanes, who straight up mocked the idea that gods looked and acted like humans. He called out religious projections centuries before Freud did. By the time Socrates shows up, questioning becomes a full-time job. He drilled into assumptions with relentless dialogue. Plato pushed philosophy into politics, ethics, and metaphysics. Aristotle took it all apart and categorized it, laying the foundations of logic and empirical science. In Greece, thinking wasn't locked in a temple. It hit the streets. Philosophy became a fight, a tool, a way of life. And it reshaped how we ask the most basic question: what is actually true? Now, there are obviously many philosophers from ancient Greek and Roman times that we could go through. And I mean, we could go through all of them, but we'd be here forever. So I don't want to spend forever on it. I'm going to just highlight some key figures that I think are important to the discussion. Thales of Miletus. Thales is often considered the first true philosopher in Western tradition. As I mentioned already, he actually asked the radical question for his time, which was, what is the world made of? Instead of appealing to gods or myths, he proposed that everything came from a singular natural substance: water. More importantly, Thales predicted eclipses, studied geometry, and pushed the idea that nature follows understandable rules. He didn't just believe, he actually observed. Thales marked the start of a shift from myth to method, to challenge old ideas and prove new ones. Pythagoras. Pythagoras is famous for his triangle theorem, but his ideas went far beyond math class. He believed that the universe was governed by harmony, proportions, and numerical relationships. In his view, math wasn't just a tool, it was a spiritual language. He founded a philosophical community that explored ethics, the soul, and the idea of reincarnation. As I mentioned before, he did study in Egypt, as many philosophers did, but he was the only foreigner that was actually given entrance to the priesthood, and he stayed in Egypt for a long time. It's a very interesting story. He ended up getting kidnapped, and then he spent some time in jail. Then he started a cult. It was really interesting. And this cult split off into two factions. And then he was getting, the cult was getting too powerful. Then they wanted to, the people or whatever, the city wanted to take him out because, he was gaining too much power and there was dissent happening and fighting over it. But they believed in, beings? They believed that beings were human souls. And so he went to escape, and his only way of escape was through a bean field, but he didn't want to run over it to crush this is a weird story. Anyway, he let himself get caught and, unalived instead of running through beans. I would recommend, there's an episode of The Watcher of Puppet Theater where they go over him and his cult, and it's very good. I would definitely recommend checking it out. I'll try to remember to link it below as well for you guys. All right, let's get into the next philosopher. Socrates, the man who wouldn't stop asking. All right, so Socrates, another big name, most people are familiar with him. If the pre-Socratics cracked open the door to critical thinking, Socrates walked right through it and started interrogating the furniture. In democratic Athens, he was infamous for questioning anyone who thought they had life figured out. He didn't preach, write books, or claim to have answers. What he did do was start conversations, relentless, uncomfortable conversations. He would say things like, what is justice? What is virtue? And people would offer definitions, and Socrates calmly picked them apart. He wasn't fighting with anyone. He was just having calm, rational discussions. He would say things like, really, are you sure? Are you sure about that answer? Are you happy with that answer? Or is there something more there? He claimed to know only one thing, and that was that he knew nothing. but that humility was a weapon. Though what we now call the Socratic method, he exposed contradictions and forced people to re-examine their beliefs. And we know how people get when you challenge their beliefs. They get angry. People have to be ready to hear this stuff. You do it too soon, they can become very aggressive. And he wasn't trying to humiliate anyone, though many felt that way. He was instead trying to get the people of Athens to wake up, to start questioning things and finding answers together. That, of course, did make people very nervous. Like I said, challenging people's beliefs it's a shaky bridge to go on. He questioned piety, tradition, and virtue, pretty much everything the elite clung to. And that's sort of what got him. He was pissing off the elite. His most famous line, "The unexamined life is not worth living." It wasn't just catchy, it was his mission. Live honestly, think deeply, question everything. This, though, cost him everything, because the elite really feared change. Socrates was accused of impiety and corrupting the youth, and he was sentenced to, be unalived. Instead of fleeing, he calmly drank hemlock and, still talking philosophy, he just did that until the hemlock took hold and he was gone. He ended up dying for his ideas, but in doing so, he set the gold standard for critical thinking. No belief is too sacred to question. And in what happened to him, it kind of made him a martyr for the cause. And that never goes well for the elites. Plato, Socrates' student. So Socrates, he didn't leave behind any writings, but he did leave behind his best student, Plato. Plato made sure that his legacy stuck. Plato didn't just preserve the Socratic spirit, he built it into a system. His dialogues, Socratic questioning, became dialect, a structured back and forth method designed to stress test ideas and expose contradictions. In works like The Republic and Meno, characters offer definitions, and Socrates, who's Plato's stand-in, peels them apart. You say something is pious, then what is piety? Can you define it without it falling apart? For Plato, real knowledge had to be logically airtight. It wasn't enough to make claims, you had to justify them all the way down. When Plato founded the academy in Athens, he made dialect the core of education. Students weren't memorizing, they were trained to question, define terms precisely, and argue clearly and concise. Even Plato's famous ideas, like the theory of forms, weren't handed down as dogma. They were explored in conversations that often ended in open questions. Why? Because Plato believed the search for truth mattered more than pretending that we've already found it. You stop trying to achieve and you stop trying to find new things if you believe that you've hit your end. Later, his school evolved into academic skepticism, embracing the idea that certainty might be unreachable. That shift shows how deeply Plato rooted inquiry into Western thought. Philosophy for him wasn't about having the right answers, it was about learning to ask better questions. Aristotle, Plato's top student. All right, now we have Aristotle, who's Plato's top student. You can see like a little succession going on here from Socrates. So Aristotle didn't just ask big questions, he built the tools to answer them. Where Socrates and Plato used dialogue to probe ideas, Aristotle turned critical thinking into a system. He wanted to know not just what we should think, but how we should think it. In works like the Organon, he laid out the first formal system of logic. He introduced the syllogism, which was a way to structure arguments and test their validity. He explained how conclusions follow from premises, how to avoid sloppy reasoning, and how to spot manipulative tactics. His work on sophistical refutations is basically an ancient guide to spotting BS, with 13 fallacies still relevant today. But Aristotle didn't stop there. He tackled ethics, politics, biology, metaphysics. In science, he promoted observation and classification, which were the early steps towards the scientific method itself. He had his students dissecting animals. His political works analyzed real-world governments. And unlike Plato, Aristotle rejected transcendent forms. Truth, he said, lives in the world around us. His distinction between deductive and inductive reasoning, principles versus evidence, became the foundation of both philosophy and science. Later thinkers debated him, refined him, but never ignored him. Aristotle didn't just practice reason, he gave it a blueprint. Aristotle was kind of like the amalgamation of all the philosophers before him, and he accomplished quite a lot. But now let's get into the Hellenistic era of this region. Hellenistic Era. The Hellenistic period kicked off with Alexander the Great's death in 323 BCE, and it wrapped up when Rome took Egypt in 30 BCE. It was a wild stretch of history where Greek culture didn't just spread, it collided and blended with the traditions of Egypt, Persia, and many other countries. It was also around the time, the fall of the mighty Egypt, so it was a very defining period. It wasn't just Greek influence, it was like the fusion of many cultures. Greek language, art, science, and philosophy got exported across the Mediterranean and Near East. Greek ideas met local customs, and something new emerged, a mashup of East and West that changed the intellectual landscape. Philosophy splintered into competing schools, and two of the schools, the Epicurians and the Skeptics, put critical thinking at the center of everything. Epicurians and Skeptics. Epicurus took Democritus's atomism and stripped it of its superstition. Gods, maybe they existed, but they don't interfere. Fear of death seems pointless. Natural causes explain the stuff people used to panic over, like thunder, plagues. Those used to be explained by gods and so forth, but now they understood it was nature. The Roman poet Lucretius ran with this in his work called On the Nature of Things, using science to push back on religious fear and cruelty. Epicureans trusted the senses, reasoned through observation, and aimed for a calm, content living. That meant rejecting the rat race for wealth and status and living a more simple life. Skeptics like Pyrrho and later Sextus, Epicurus took another route, a radical doubt. For every claim, there's a counterclaim. So why take sides? Their idea was to suspend judgment and find peace in uncertainty. Academic skeptics like Carneades turned debate into an art form, flipping arguments to show how unstable our assumptions really are. Both schools, one focused on fearless reason, the other on disciplined doubt, kept philosophy honest by refusing to accept lazy thinking. All right, now let's talk about the other leaders of ideas and schools of critical thought that further developed after this period. Critical thought in the Roman era. By the late Hellenistic period, Greek philosophy had already laid the groundwork for skepticism and critical thought, but the Roman era gave it a new life, not by reinventing it, but by applying it to the real world. Cicero was a philosopher who brought Greek philosophy to Rome with flair. A politician and a rhetorician, he leaned into academic skepticism, the idea that the truth is best approached by weighing both sides. In his dialogues, he rarely picks a side. He just lets the arguments play out. For Cicero, that was the point. Rational debate, not blind belief. In politics and philosophy, he believed ideas should be tested, not taken for granted. Another person, Lucretius, was busy dismantling superstition in poetic form. As we already mentioned him before, his Epicurean work on the nature of things used science to fight fear, especially fear of gods and fear of death. He further argued that irrational religion leads people to do terrible things, and reason was the antidote to it all. Now, another thing that thrived in Rome was Stoicism. Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BCE. He taught that the universe runs on rational order and that we should align with it. That meant challenging your emotions, your desires, and society's fake priorities. Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius all taught that reason was the only solid ground. Seneca critiqued everything from greed to superstition. Epictetus drilled his students to question every thought and emotion. And Marcus, he wrote personal reflections about stripping away ego, fear, and social noise. He was like a skeptic emperor journaling his own soul. Many Stoics paid the price for speaking out, though. Paetus and others openly criticized Roman emperors and were exiled or unalived for it. But that's how committed they were to the truth over comfort. Just like Pythagoras would rather die than run over beans, these people also would, die for their cause. And cynics took it even further than that. Diogenes of Sinope lived in an actual tub. He begged for food and told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight. His life was a protest against luxury, status, and hypocrisy. Like, these philosophers, they went hard back then. Later cynics like Hipparchia kept the fire going by proving that real freedom means cutting through the noise and living with raw honesty. The Stoics built an inner fortress of reason. Cynics burned down the house of false values. Different methods, same mission. Live by truth, not tradition. And finally, in the 2nd century CE, Sextus Empiricus wrapped up the skeptical tradition with his work Outlines of Pyrrhonism. He didn't just question religion or politics, he questioned grammar, math, and logic itself. For him, peace came from suspending judgment and refusing to commit to dogma. By the end of the classical world, Greece had asked the big questions. Rome turned them into action. The result? A philosophical legacy that still shapes how we think, question, and demand evidence to this day. All right, now we're going to move further east. Ancient India. To start off, I'm going to admit that I never did push my knowledge as much on ancient India, China, and so forth. I always loved learning about ancient civilizations, but had a tendency to drift back to Egypt and Greece and Rome and kind of spent most of my time there, even to the medieval area. When I think back on it, honestly, I think school also stuck in these areas. I don't know if this is maybe just a product of the Western world or something else, but it got me thinking that I wanted to at least explore a couple other civilizations in this video so that we don't just stick with the standards that we always talk about in the Western side of the world here. I don't know what it's like, over in Europe or anything, but we have a tendency to stick within that Rome, Egypt, and Europe kind of area. I know there's also some history in the Middle East and other areas, but the notes for this video were already getting really long, so I had to pick and choose my battles here. And I decided that I wanted to cover India and China for this video. However, there is some really interesting history from Babylon and the Middle East and such. Perhaps I'll explore a video just for that separately, but I think I maybe want to cover a different context with that and maybe to do with the Ars Goetia or the religions or something. There's interesting stories to be told from there for sure. So that being said, I'm going to try to cover some of the history and critical thought within India and China. If I get any dates, names, concept, areas, etc. incorrect, I apologize. If you want to add anything to the conversation on these regions, please do leave a comment below. And if there's a region or something that you'd like to see discussed at some point, leave a comment below and let me know too. The world is huge. All right, let's dive into India. Ancient India wasn't a one-note culture. It was a full-on philosophical brawl. Starting in the 6th century BCE, Vedic orthodoxy got seriously challenged by a wave of thinkers and schools known as the Shramana movements. I'm going to butcher these pronunciations. I do apologize. I am trying. Buddhists, Jains, Ājīvikas, and hardcore materialists like the Cārvākas all rejected the authority of the Vedas, caste, and ritualism. Instead of obeying tradition, they wanted to ask questions, and ask they did. Public debates became the intellectual main event, often held under royal patronage. Women philosophers, who were called Gargi, debated sages in the Upanishads, which is kind of refreshing to hear because most women weren't really taken that seriously in the other areas. By 3rd century BCE, logic and dialects were part of the formal education for monks and philosophers. Kings didn't tolerate disagreement, they actually sponsored it. One example, Emperor Ashoka, a Buddhist, used his edicts to urge religious tolerance and intellectual humility. He warned against sectarian arrogance and encouraged people to honor other traditions, not just their own. Under his reign, rival schools like Buddhism, Jainism, Brahmism, and Ājīvikas all got state support. Debate wasn't just allowed, it was actually policy. But let's just back it up a little bit to talk about some of the key schools of thought before all this. Jainism, many angles, one reality. Founded by Mahavira, Jainism added nuance to India's intellectual scene. Its core idea says that truth is multi-sided. No single viewpoint captures reality completely. Jain philosophers built a maybe doctrine, which treated all claims as conditional. Their debates trained thinkers to weigh multiple viewpoints and seek common ground. For this one, people refer to a parable called The Blind Men and the Elephant. So in this parable, it's a story of a group of blind men. They've never come across an elephant before, and they all learn together about an elephant by touching it and feeling what it feels like. But each blind man feels a different part of the animal's body. One the tusk, one, the skin, one the whiskers, so forth. They describe the animal based on their limited experience of what they're currently feeling. And their descriptions of the elephant are all different from one another. So this parable is like a thought exercise. They're all partly right, but none of them see the entire picture. This wasn't just logic, it was also ethics too. Jainism extended nonviolence to intellectual life as well. You didn't attack someone's ideas, you listened, you questioned, and you responded. And that's how you got closer to the truth, trying to remove the aggression from the conversation. The Cārvākas, ancient India's atheists. By the 6th and 5th century BCE, the Cārvākas materialist school had already tossed out the soul, karma, and the afterlife. They believed in what you could see and touch. Direct perception was the only valid source of knowledge. Everything else was dubious at best. Thinkers like Ājīvikas claimed death was the end. The body dissolves and that's it. No cosmic justice, no next life, just this one and only. Unsurprisingly, Orthodox schools hated these thinkers. All the Cārvāka texts were lost, surviving only in attack literature. But it tells you how influential they were because they were scaring people to the point that they were creating smear campaigns in their own literature. But they forced the conversation. Their radical doubt made other schools up their game. They didn't say, trust me, they said, prove it. Buddhism. Don't believe, verify. The Buddha didn't just break from the Vedas, he broke from blind faith itself. In a text, the Kalama Sutta, he told listeners not to believe something because it's old, written, or sounds smart. Instead, you should test it and see if it reduces suffering. If it does, then keep it. Early Buddhist tradition made room for serious debate. A text laid out doctrinal arguments point by point. Buddhist universities became hubs of logic and reasoning. Figures like Nagarjuna used deep analysis and paradox to challenge metaphysical assumptions. The Buddha avoided cosmic speculation and focused on experience. Truth wasn't something you memorized, it was something you lived. That made Buddhism a philosophy of rational insight, not obedience. Ājīvikas, fatalism as rebellion. Founded by Macaulay Gosala, the Ājīvikas took a different route, cosmic determinism. Their doctrine said that everything, suffering, joy, salvation, was pre-written. Karma and free will, useless. You were just writing out a preloaded script. This fatalism clashed hard with the other schools. But like the Cārvākas, they kept the debate sharp. And they stuck around for centuries. There were even some kings that backed them as well. Emperor Asoka gave them patronage, which showed that India's rulers were often more tolerant than you'd expect from comparing to other countries. Some Ājīvikas texts even hinted at atomic theory, suggesting a bit of proto-scientific curiosity behind all the fatalism. They might not have believed in agency, but they made everyone else clarify why it mattered. Nyāya, ancient India's logic engine. Founded by the sage Gautama, the Nyāya school took center stage at India's homegrown logic powerhouse. They believed that suffering comes from ignorance and the fix is rational knowledge. They built a whole system around a concept of valid sources of knowledge, perception, interference, analogy, and expert testimony. If your claim didn't rest on one of these, then it was nonsense. Nyāya thinkers laid out how to argue, how to spot bad reasoning, and how to avoid logical traps. They even cataloged fallacies from unproven premise to contradictions. If you wanted to debate in ancient India and not get completely wrecked and rolled over, you had to actually study Nyāya. It wasn't about memorizing beliefs, it was about backing them up. And that's what made this the gold standard for critical thought in Indian philosophy. It actually quite matches the Aristotle rules as well. So, ancient India hosted a battlefield of ideas, not by silencing dissent, but by engaging with it. Skeptics weren't exiled, they were debated. Philosophies weren't imposed, they were argued over, sharpened, and reworked. For nearly 1,000 years, India built a culture where logic mattered, belief had to earn its keep, and no idea, not even the gods, was above questioning. All right, now let's take a look at ancient China. Ancient China. Okay, so with China, I took this on because China always interests me, but there's so many words I'm 100% not going to pronounce right, and I'm sorry ahead of time. So with China, we have a number of schools of thoughts that overlap each other in the timeline. During the Eastern Zhou era, especially the Warring States period, which was 475 to 221 BCE, China became a battleground of ideas. With no emperor enforcing dogma, rival states became labs for live philosophical testing. Kings hired thinkers like political strategists, and the result was what they nicknamed the 100 Schools of Thought. Confucians, Mohists, Daoists, legalists, logicians, all debating in public and on paper. One scholar even complained that everyone contradicted each other, which, seeing how these all overlap one another in the same timeline, they definitely contradict one another. So let's take a look at each of them. I'm just going to do a quick overview. Confucianism, 600 BCE. Confucianism, also known as Ruism, is a system of thought and behavior originating in ancient China. It emphasized ethics, social order, and good governance, with a focus on piety and respect for elders. The founder of Confucianism is Confucius, or his name was Confucius, a Chinese philosopher and teacher who lived in the 6th century BCE. Confucius' followers compiled his teachings into the 4 books and 5 classics, which are all considered authoritative texts in Confucianism. But pretty much the core principles are an emphasis on ethics and morality. Confucianism prioritizes ethical behavior, social harmony, and good governance. It very much is about respect for parents and ancestors, social harmony, fulfilling one's role in a structured hierarchy. Obedience to elders and authority is a central part of it. Confucianism values education as a path to personal growth and social contribution, aiming to create a balanced and harmonious society. The focus is on practical present-day life rather than preparing for the afterlife. Confucianism deeply influenced the culture, politics, and education of China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, shaping social norms and institutions all across East Asia. Daoism, 450 to 300 BCE. Daoism, also known as Taoism, is a Chinese philosophy and religion emphasizing on harmony with the natural order, which is Tao, and living in accordance with the universe's spontaneous flow. Lao Tzu is credited as the founder of Daoism, although some scholars believe he actually may be just a mythical figure. The core concepts of Daoism is, I'll just go through the list really briefly here. Tao, or Tao, the ultimate principle behind all existence. It's the natural path that Taoists seek to follow. Next is Wu Wei, which is effortless action, living in flow with the Tao, without force or resistance. Then we have Ziran, naturalness aligning with nature and one's authentic self. Then we have yin and yang, which most people are familiar with, and that's the interacting opposites that maintain balance in the universe. And then self-cultivation, practices like meditation, huingyang, and inner alchemy to foster balance and growth. And lastly, we have virtues, compassion, frugality, and humility They're all central ethical values. Taoism has deeply shaped Chinese art, literature, medicine, martial arts, and spirituality. While both Taoism and Confucianism are important philosophical traditions in China, they have distinct focuses. Confucianism emphasizes social harmony and ethical behavior, while Taoism focuses on the natural order and individual self-cultivation. Mohists, logic versus ritual. While Confucians clung to tradition, Mazi asked, is it useful? If not, toss it out. His 3 tests, sage approval, benefit to the people, and practical success, formed the core of Mohist ethics. Mohists also pioneered logic. Their canons dissected analogies, causation, and mechanics. Mozi promoted impartial care, helped everyone equally, and used reason to oppose war and fatalism. When king rule crushed Mohism, it faded, but Mazi's legacy stuck. Reason should serve humanity. Zhuangzi, Skepticism with a Smile, 400 BCE. Zhuangzi didn't argue, he told mind-bending stories. In one, he dreams he's a butterfly, then questions if he's now a man dreaming he's a butterfly. The point is, maybe certainty is an illusion. In The Joy of Fish, he flips a debate about the knowledge into meditation on perspective. Zhuangzi didn't defy truth, he doubted we could ever grasp it fully. He mocked sages and scholars, praised wanderers and butchers, and invited readers to loosen their grip on dogma. His playful relativism became a lasting influence on Taoism and Zen. Zhuangzi, rational Confucian. Zhuangzi stayed loyal to Confucian ethics, but ditched the superstition. Heaven isn't moral, he said. It's just nature. Omens, coincidence, rituals, useful special tools, but not cosmic truths. He pushed for precise language. If words don't reflect reality, then logic breaks. His essay, called Redification of Names, laid the foundation for Chinese analytical philosophy. Zhuangzi debated rival schools head-on. Ironically, his students helped create the authoritarian king regime, something he probably didn't have in mind. Han Fizi, 280 to 233 BCE. Han Fizi, Zhuangzi's sharpest student, took skepticism to power. People aren't virtuous, he argued. They're self-interested. So rulers need fa, which was clear laws and hard consequences. His logic was ruthless. Even good officials will act selfishly unless systems constrain them. Like a crossbow, government should work mechanically, not morally. He distrusted moralizers and smooth-talking scholars. He saw them all as a threat to order. Although he died before the king rose, his ideas actually fueled king's rule. The Crackdown and the Underground, 213 BCE and beyond. They say that this ended around 136 BCE, but some people kind of say beyond because it's a continuing thing. So I think it's just like a memory that people try to live by or whatever. When the Qing Empire unified China, it shut down the conversation. In 213 BCE, books were burned and scholars vanished, except for practical texts. The Han Dynasty tried to repair the damage, and by 136 BCE, Confucianism became the official ideology. But debate didn't die. The discourses of Salt and Iron recorded fierce policy clashes, and thinkers like Wang Chong in the 1st century CE attacked superstition from inside the Confucian fold. He championed natural explanations and logical clarity, keeping the skeptical flame alive. China's classical thinkers didn't disappear, they morphed. Taoist doubt resurfaced in Zen and poetry. Legalist structure shaped dynasties. Even Confucianism absorbed rival insights. The Golden Age was 6th and 3rd centuries BCE, but its echoes kept ringing. Mazi, Zhuangzi, Zunzi, Han Fizi, they didn't agree, but they all said, don't just believe, think. And that spirit never really left. All right, so I know that's a lot of different schools of thought and ideas, and I just very briefly summarized them. And I'm sure there's a ton of more detail. I mean, I saw there was a ton more detail, and it's probably stuff I overlooked by accident. It's just a little bit too much for this one video. So I want to get on to the Victorian era, so we're going to move on from here. But, you know, if you have any comments on this, definitely leave it below. The Victorian era spiritualist movement. By the mid-19th century, society was changing very quickly. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping the world. Science was advancing at lightning speeds, and people were caught between awe and uncertainty. Into that space came spiritualism, a belief that the dead could be contacted through mediums, seances, and mysterious knocks from the other side. I do cover the history of seances and all this stuff in my History of Seance video, which I'll try to link, but just a quick little summary. It started in the 1840s with the Fox sisters in upstate New York. They claimed to communicate with spirits by using rapping sounds. From there, it exploded across the Western world. As we later find out, those rapping sounds were them, messing with double joints in their body. Seances became living room entertainment. Spirit photography convinced people that they saw ghosts in silver nitrate, and mediums offered messages from beyond, often for a fee. But as belief spread, so did doubt. Enter the debunkers. And now we get introduced to our official debunking. With more people claiming supernatural powers, others began to investigate. Magicians, scientists, and critical thinkers attended seances to expose fraud. They revealed hidden wires, double-sided slates, sleight of hand, and all kinds of tricks used to manipulate grieving families and curious minds. One of the most iconic figures in this movement of debunking was Harry Houdini, the legendary escape artist who made it his mission to expose fraudulent spiritualists. We'll talk about him more in detail in the next section. Alongside him were scientific societies, skeptical publications, and the birth of paranormal investigation as an actual serious discipline, not just to prove, but to disprove. And this was the first time in history that skepticism became a cultural counterweight to mass belief. And it marked the beginning of modern debunking as a public organized effort. All right, now I'm just going to highlight two key figures of the debunking movement of this time. Harry Houdini, the showman who fought fraud. All right, first up, we got to discuss Harry Houdini. Houdini was more than just a legendary escape artist. He was one of history's earliest and most passionate debunkers of paranormal fraud. In the early 1900s, as spiritualism surged in popularity, Houdini turned his sharp eye toward mediums who claimed to contact the dead. What began as curiosity became a personal crusade after the death of his beloved mother. Despite attending countless seances, Houdini found no real evidence, only cheap tricks designed to exploit grief. Disguised and determined, he infiltrated seances, exposed secret mechanisms, and even recreated spirit phenomena on stage to show how easily people could be fooled. Using his deep knowledge of illusion and deception, he publicly unmasked fraudulent mediums, including the famous Mina Marjorie Crandon, during investigations for Scientific America. Houdini didn't just call out fraud, he educated the public. He revealed how tricks work, he taught people to question what they saw. His book, A Magician Among Spirits, became a manifesto for skeptical inquiry. Houdini's blend of showmanship and critical thinking laid the groundwork for modern skeptical investigation. He proved that skepticism wasn't about cynicism. It was about protecting truth, honoring the grieving, and refusing to let belief be manipulated by spectacle. All right, the next person I want to cover was also a very important figure for modern-day paranormal investigations. Harry Price, the Gentleman Ghostbuster. As Houdini covered North America, Harry Price began working in his home country of England. I've covered him before in my History of Seances video. Harry Price is an important figure as he really pioneered the idea of applying the scientific method to paranormal investigations. Harry Price was a British paranormal investigator who brought a unique mix of scientific curiosity and theatrical flair to the world of ghost hunting. Best known for his work on the Borley Rectory, often called the most haunted house in England, Price meticulously documented alleged hauntings using interviews, instruments, and long-term observations. He wasn't a cynic, but he wasn't a gullible believer either. Price was open to the idea that some phenomena might be real, but he insisted on one thing above all: evidence. He actually started out as a stage magician. Price developed a sharp eye for deception, and this background made him especially effective at spotting trickery among the mediums and spiritualists during the height of the seance craze. After a stint in the Society for Psychical Research, he founded the National Laboratory of Psychical Research, where he tested paranormal claims using psychology, stagecraft, and emerging scientific methods. His investigations often walked the line between entertainment and inquiry, and he knew how to capture public interest. But beneath the showmanship was genuine commitment to critical thinking. Price was paramount in helping to legitimize skeptical investigation as something both curious and careful, applying reason to topics often ruled by emotion or superstition. Though some of his methods were later criticized, Harry Price remains one of the most influential and controversial figures in the 20th century psychical research. His work helped define modern paranormal investigation and carved out a space for rational inquiry in a field full of smoke and mirrors. Now, with the introduction of Harry Price, let's dive deeper into the 20th century. The early 20th century laid roots down. Between the work of Houdini, Harry Price, and others, an important organization was started up called the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research. The SPR, or Society for Psychical Research, was where science could meet the supernatural. It was founded in 1882. The Society for Psychical Research was the first organization in the world to take a scholarly, systematic approach to investigating psychic and paranormal phenomena. Based in the UK, the SPR positioned itself as a kind of intellectual Switzerland, not committed to proving or disproving anything, just committed to finding out what was really going on. They were all meant to be very neutral in their investigations. Its early members included physicists, psychologists, writers, and philosophers, including Henry Sidgwick, who served as the first president. The group emerged from conversations between journalist Edmund Rogers and physicist William F. Barrett, eventually bringing together figures like Frederick Myers, Edmund Gurney, and Stanton Moses, and their whole goal was to investigate claims of mediumship, hauntings, thought transference, or what we now call telepathy, hypnosis, and other experiences that defied conventional science. The SPR was responsible for introducing a lot of the terms that we use today, like telepathy, and for organizing some of the first major studies of dissociation, trance states, and altered consciousness. It wasn't just about ghosts, it was about the edges of human experience. They even initiated the first International Congress of Experimental Psychology. The organization was also one of the few scientific societies of the time to include women, even if slowly and with some hesitation, but there was women actually being heard in this organization. Mary Everest Boole was the first female member, and others like Jane Barlow and Eleanor Sidgwick would go on to leave a much bigger mark. I'll be doing another video discussing the women of debunking after this one. It'll be a smaller video. Today, the SPR still exists. It holds lectures, publishes journals, and hosts events. It continues to walk the tightrope between open-minded inquiry and scientific rigor, a legacy that has shaped both the history of skepticism and belief. By the mid-20th century, critical thinking had moved from lecture halls and laboratories into the public spotlight. This was the era of UFO sightings, psychic hotlines, alien abductions, the power of pyramids, etc. And while belief soared, so did the skeptics. This started a new wave of scientists, journalists, magicians who weren't content to just sit on the sidelines. They formed organizations, launched publications, and appeared on talk shows to challenge the extraordinary claims with extraordinary scrutiny. I just want to cover a couple key figures of this time. James Randi, the investigator who made belief squirm. James Randi, magician, author, and legendary skeptic. He didn't just question the paranormal, he made it sweat. Known to the world as the Amazing Randi, he turned his skills as an illusionist into tools for critical inquiry and public education. Randi began as a magician before dedicating his life to exposing deception. He co-founded CSICOP, which was PsyCop, which is now CSI, Center for Skeptical Inquiry, which is under the CFI umbrella, which I'm probably getting that wrong. Anyway, in 1996, he founded the James Randi Educational Foundation, or JREF, best known for its $1 million paranormal challenge. The prize was offered to anyone who could prove supernatural powers under agreed testing conditions. No one ever actually won. The JREF also published educational content through its blog Swift, and beginning in 2003, JREF hosted the Amazing Meeting. It was a major annual conference for skeptics, scientists, and freethinkers, and it was running until Randi's retirement in 2015. In 1973, Randi helped set up Uri Geller's infamous failure on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, advising the show to use props Geller couldn't control. That single broadcast reshaped public awareness of psychic fraud. Randi spent decades exposing false claims, from faith healers and psychic surgeons to televangelists like Peter Popoff. He used magic not just to entertain, but to reveal the mechanics of deception. Though he disliked the term debunker, Randi embraced skepticism as a way to protect people from harm. His work inspired a new generation of skeptics, including Penn and Teller, and helped push critical thinking into the spotlight. Randi passed away in 2020, but his legacy continues to guide the skeptical movement. Carl Sagan, the voice of science and skepticism. Carl Sagan was one of the 20th century's most influential champions of critical thinking, scientific skepticism, and rational inquiry. He wasn't just an astronomer, he was a science communicator who made logic beautiful and curiosity contagious. Scientifically, he broke ground on exobiology, played a key role in NASA missions, helped explain greenhouse gas effect on Venus. He also helped craft humanity's first interstellar messages, the Pioneer Plaque and the Voyager Golden Record. But Sagan's lasting impact was cultural. He urged people to think clearly and compassionately. He became known for his concepts to identify pseudoscience, fallacies, and fuzzy logic. Sagan was a founding fellow of PsychOp, which is now the CSI, Center for Scientific Inquiry, alongside James Randi, Isaac Asimov, and Paul Kurtz. He advocated for a skeptical mindset that combined wonder with rigorous inquiry. He challenged UFO claims, astrology, alien abduction, and faith healing, always asking for evidence and helping others do the same. At the 1994 PsychOp conference, he warned against the us versus them thinking and emphasized openness to new ideas while staying grounded in science. Even back then, he was kind of trying to encourage this para-unity thing. His writings often appeared in The Skeptical Inquirer, and his influence on the skeptical movement cannot be overstated. Until his death in 1996, Sagan promoted the idea that science isn't just a body of knowledge, it's a way of thinking essential to democracy and human progress. His legacy continues to guide anyone committed to reason, evidence, and the poetic wonder of the cosmos. The rise of organized skepticism. All right, let's talk a little bit about the PsychOp and some of the organizations. In 1976, the skeptical movement took a major leap forward. A group of scientists, as we said, scientists, magicians, writers, philosophers, they joined forces to push back against the rising tide of all the pseudoscience and psychics and stuff that were out there. The result was them starting CSICOP, the PsychOp, which is the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal.
Why was PsychOp founded?
PsychOp was founded in 1976 by leading scientists and skeptics the world over. Its purpose is to encourage the critical investigation of paranormal and fringe science claims, then to report the factual results of those investigations to the public. PsychOp is a nonprofit scientific and educational organization. Its journal, The Skeptical Inquirer, is read worldwide. Similar organizations now exist in more than 22 countries. Perhaps the most important reason is that fellows and supporters have helped to generate one of the richest bodies of scientific literature on the paranormal that has ever existed.
I think the acronym name sounds pretty cool and looks kind of cool, like spelt out, but of course it's very long, so they ended up like shortening it at some point. So, like I said, it was founded by Paul Kurtz and backed by James Randi, Carl Sagan, Isaac Asimov, Martin Gardner, and PsychOp was built to defend reason and promote critical thinking. Their mission was investigate extraordinary claims using scientific methods and share the findings with the public. They weren't out to mock anyone, they were out to test. When they investigated and claims fell apart under scrutiny, they would explain why. They would go into detail and share all the evidence. Pretty much, their unwritten motto was like, show us the proof. As Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They started up a magazine, The Skeptical Inquirer, which quickly became the movement's voice. That magazine would publish the myth-busting articles and the clear explanations and real investigations. I go into quite a bit of detail in the magazine articles. And then, like I said, PsychOp also hosted a conference. And in that conference, they had educational programs as well that helped people learn how to think critically in everyday life. In 2015, PsychOp became CSI, the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And CSI joined the Center for Inquiry, as Center for Inquiry is like an umbrella organization that connects the science, skepticism, and secular values. CFI was founded in 1991 by Kurtz, bringing together CSI, the Council for Secular Humanism, and other groups focused on evidence-based public education. They tackle paranormal claims, creationism, faith healing, and much more, using science and reason as tools for public understanding. In 2016, CFI merged with the Richard Dawkins Foundation, expanding its reach in science communication and secular advocacy. There's multiple organizations all connected to one another, then they all speak to one another. If you're interested, like to go research it a little bit more. And James Randi passed away, so there's no longer $1 million prize. So CFI took it over, and they offer now a $500,000 prize to anyone who can demonstrate supernatural abilities under proper testing conditions. So far, again, no one has won. Today, CFI and CSI continue the mission, questioning wild claims, promoting science, and reminding the world that logic and evidence still matter. And all this work that they put in, by the 1990s, early 2000s, skepticism really became more grassroots. Teachers, librarians, everyday people joined in, from classrooms to online message boards. Then we have YouTubers now, TikTokers on social media too. Critical thinking is now like a community. And this era, it all set the stage for the digital skepticism and the outreach and the fight against online misinformation. And then that leads us into the 21st century. 21st century. So these go hand in hand. But as we entered the 21st century, critical thinking found itself in a brand new arena, the internet. The same tools that empowered people to access more knowledge also made it easier for misinformation to spread like wildfire. And with the introduction of social media, it's just gotten real bad. The viral videos, clickbait headlines, all of it has created a world where false claims can reach millions of people in seconds. And in that noisy space, modern skeptics had to step up. Like I said, there's YouTube channels, there's podcasters, fact-checking websites, science communications that are online for free, people can sign up for or look at, online education courses. All these people, all of us, are breaking down conspiracy theories, hoaxes, paranormal claims, and often in real time. Content creator debunkers on TikTok and YouTube and social media, and science educators around the globe, they brought skepticism to people's feeds, making critical thinking accessible, engaging, and urgent. But, our voices are small compared to those putting out the fake stuff. Movements like rational skepticism, science literacy, and media literacy really took off in a lot of these communities. Some schools are teaching them. It'd be nice if more did, but digital tools also, like Snopes and PolitiFact, help bridge the gap between fast-moving claims and well-researched truth. It's a good place to point people to as well. But it hasn't been easy. The pace of misinformation combined with the algorithms that reward emotion over evidence, it means skepticism is more important and more difficult than ever before. But still, the spirit of the ancient philosopher lives on. The tools may have changed, but the mission hasn't. Stay curious, ask better questions, and never stop thinking and questioning things. The legacy of debunkers. From ancient Egypt to modern day, the thread of critical thinking has always been there, challenging myths, questioning power, and searching for the truth. Every age has had its critical thinkers, asking better questions and replacing belief with understanding. And today, the mission continues. Our goals remain the same: clarity over confusion, truth over illusion. If you've ever paused to fact check a claim or asked, "Is this real?" then you're part of this legacy. So whether you're breaking down conspiracies or just thinking a little deeper, keep that fire alive. Also, I want to add that there will be a History of Women Debunking video coming shortly as well. And Susan Gerbic is writing an article on women in debunking history as well. So I'll link all that stuff when everything's done too. Also, I'm going to try to put links of as many debunker YouTubers and stuff that I can think to follow. It probably will get a little bit big, so I don't know. I'm going to try my best to put who I can think of. But if there's people that you want to suggest, definitely throw it down in the comments. Everyone check out the comments for advice on who else to follow, who are debunkers and rational thinkers. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It does help the channel out. As well, speaking of helping the channel out, I want to thank all the members for all your support. I really do appreciate it. It does help everything out as well. And just a reminder for anyone who is curious about membership, it includes ad-free viewing. You get early access to videos or special access. There's some members only videos as well, and you get access to some recording sessions too. You can check out more by clicking the join button below. Okay, that's it for today. I'll see you guys in the next video.